Subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for joining us today for a second in a series of hearings on the Trafficking Persons Report and U.S. efforts to combat human trafficking. In April, our subcommittee took a close look at the records of 6 countries which had exhausted all of their allotted time on the Tier 2 watch list and must, by law, move to either Tier 2 or Tier 3 in this year's Trafficking in Persons Report. One of those who testified was Ambassador Lucy DeBacca's predecessor in the job, Mark Lagon, and we heard very, I think, insightful testimony about why countries, including China, Russia, and Uzbekistan, ought to have been put on Tier 3. An upgrade to Tier 2 would have been completely unmerited and would have damaged the credibility of the Trafficking in Persons Report. The TIP report that was released late last month, however, I'm pleased to say, is one of the best, and that it faithfully reported and graded the records of China, Russia, and Uzbekistan, which had been skirting accountability for far too long. Now the administration is faced with next steps, including what sanctions might be imposed to press these nations to reform. When I wrote the law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, that created not only this report, but also the Office to Combat and Monitor Trafficking in Persons and Mr. Ambassador Lucy DeBacca's position in the U.S. Department of State, and several other provisions to prevent both sex and labor trafficking, to protect victims and prosecute traffickers, it was sincerely hoped that this report would become the international gold standard and primary means of anti-trafficking accountability around the world. I'm happy to say it has. From the halls of parliaments globally to police stations in remote corners of the world, this report is today being used to focus anti-trafficking, a searchlight on the work that is occurring or not occurring in some 186 countries. But with the power of this report to improve situations came the risk that it could also be used to whitewash the truth about a country's trafficking record. It could fail to report accurately and inadvertently give cover to negligent or complicit governments. I'm very happy to say that the 2013 report is one of the best ever produced. Special thanks are especially in order for Ambassador Louis C. DeBacca and his very dedicated staff for faithfully highlighting the good while exposing the bad and the ugly. The TIP report is faithful and reflects the hard, meticulous work and leadership of the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. This office not only analyzes whether a country is complying with the minimum standards for the elimination of human trafficking, but also sets specific recommendations as to how that country can move forward. With this report, countries should have no question whatsoever about where they rank as well as how they can improve. Many countries have publicly or privately credited the report as an impetus for real improvement in their trafficking laws and policies. Since the TIP report inception, more than 133 countries have enacted anti-trafficking laws, and many countries have taken other steps required to significantly raise their tier earnings. I just returned from Istanbul on Saturday for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and offered a resolution there on trafficking and especially some of the best practices that Ambassador DeBacca and I have been talking about, and where flight attendants can be trained as to how to spot a trafficking as it occurs while that woman or women or victims are being moved and transported. Not only did it pass unanimously, but many of the heads of delegation have made it very clear that they're going to go back to their capitals and take up that idea. I also talked to many of the heads of delegation and members of parliaments about the TIP report. Many of them knew about it. Some of them were unhappy that our country takes it upon itself to hold them accountable. But as I told each and every one of them, not only do we rate ourselves, but even more importantly, borders are no excuse for human rights abuse. And if we really want to end modern-day slavery, what is contained in this all-important book helps them and helps all of us. It's a guide as to how to improve our efforts. This year, China, Russia, and Uzbekistan finally have to confront their records. The report tells it like it is. For example, the TIP report states that, and I quote in pertinent part, the Chinese government's birth limitation policy and a cultural preference for sons created a skewed ratio of 118 boys to 100 girls in China, which served as a key source for demand for the trafficking of foreign women and brides for Chinese men and forced prostitution. Women from Burma, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Mongolia are transported to China after being recruited through marriage brokers or fraudulent employment offers, the report goes on, where they are subsequently subjected to forced prostitution and forced labor. Traffickers recruited girls and young women, often rural areas of China, using a combination of fraudulent job offers, imposition of large travel fees, and threats of physical or financial harm to obtain and maintain their service in prostitution." Close quote. Because tens of millions of girls have been systematically killed by sex selection abortion over the past 3 decades, resulted in an unprecedented number of missing women and girls in China, demand for prostitutes and so-called brides is absolutely exploding in China, and it's not getting any better anytime soon. As a direct consequence of the barbaric one-child-per-couple policy in effect since 1979, China has become the global magnet for sex traffickers. Women and young girls have been, and are today, being reduced to commodities and coerced into prostitution. Without serious and sustained action by Beijing and the international community, it is only going to get worse. The TIP report also makes clear that Chinese law remains inadequate, and I quote here, "to combat all forms of trafficking, and the government of China's efforts to protect trafficking victims remain inadequate. In addition, China's government continues to perpetuate human trafficking in at least 320 state-run institutions." I, along with Congressman Frank Wolf, visited one of those state-run institutions in the early 1990s, Beijing Prison No. 1. We were shocked to observe the horrific conditions imposed on inmates, including more than 40 Tiananmen Square human rights activists. The report makes clear that state-sponsored forced labor is part of a systemic form of repression known as re-education through labor. The government reportedly profits from this forced labor and many prisoners and detainees, close quote. With this report, we have done right by the millions of trafficking victims in China. With this report, we are holding China to account for its complicity in profits off modern-day slavery. It is my sincere hope that the truth will turn the tide in China. However, I am disappointed, and I would say this with all respect to my friend and Ambassador Lucia DeBaca, we were disappointed, many of us, to see that Vietnam was not downgraded to Tier 2 watch list or to Tier 3. Vietnam's labor export companies, most of which are owned by or affiliated with the government of Vietnam, have been engaged in practices that lead to debt bondage and forced labor. The government of Vietnam has yet to pay millions of dollars of damages to Vietnamese labor trafficking victims found in the United States and its territories as ordered by U.S. courts. Vietnamese trafficking victims in other countries report that government of Vietnam sides with the traffickers to keep them in bondage when the victims seek help. Other reports indicate that the Vietnamese embassy in Russia, and we had a hearing on this, is actively working with organized crime to enslave Vietnamese nationals in sweatshops and brothels. And the TIP report itself notes reports that officials at border crossings and checkpoints accept bribes from traffickers. Some notable trends in the 2013 report include Tier 1, 30 countries as compared to 33 in 2012, Tier 2, 92 countries as compared to 93 in 2012, Tier 2 watch list, 44 countries as compared to 42 in 2012, and Tier 3, 20 countries as compared to 17 in 2012. The African region increased its prosecutions by 45%, according to the report, labor prosecutions by 500%, its convictions by 16%, and its victims' identification by 13%. The African region, however, is the region with the greatest number of Tier 3 countries and does not contain any Tier 1 countries. The East Asia and Pacific region saw a 23% decrease in prosecutions, but a 28% increase in convictions and a slight increase in the number of victims who were identified. The number of victims identified remained alarmingly low, however, at 8,521, in a region where the ILO has said that there are nearly 12 million people enslaved. The number of labor convictions 103, also remains extremely low in a region of the world plagued by labor trafficking. The European region saw a slight drop in prosecutions, but a 13% increase in convictions and a 17% increase in victims identified. I would note parenthetically that since 2008, in the European space, some 54,000 victims have been identified. So there is a robust effort underway there to find, identify, and help victims. The Near East region saw a 19% increase in prosecutions in 2012, more than doubled its conviction rate, largely due to efforts in the United Arab Emirates. The Near East region also more than doubled its number of victims identified. The region has the greatest relative proportion, however, of Tier 3 countries. The South and Central Asia region saw slight but appreciable increases in prosecutions, some 7%, convictions 5%, and the number of victims identified at 13. India, one of the first countries to be moved off the Tier 2 watch list under the TPVA of 2008 two-year rule, remained a questionable Tier 2 ranking for a second year. Out of a nearly 2 billion people, only 4,415 victims were identified. Finally, in the Western Hemisphere region, in which the United States, of course, is included, prosecutions increased by 72% and convictions increased by 44%, including 650% increase in labor trafficking convictions. However, victim identification, sadly, decreased by 15%. 8 countries in the region improved their anti-trafficking laws in 2012. Cuba is the only country in the region to be Tier 3. Colombia and Nicaragua share Tier 1 status with the United States and with Canada. Again, I look forward to the testimony by our very distinguished witness, Ambassador Lucia de Baca. But before that, we'll yield to my friend and colleague, the Ranking Member, Ms. Bass.